My name is Michael Weinman. I am professor of philosophy here at Bard College Berlin, and incredibly pleased and frankly honored and a bit humbled to be part of this colloquium with a really remarkable assemblage of people, not the least the panelists who are joining us now and whom I will introduce. So I will be making a brief chair's statement now, which will have three parts: who, what, and why. So who consists of a brief introduction of our three panelists. You might notice that there are only two bodies here to my right. But the second of our third panelists, whom I'll introduce in a moment, is with us via those devices over there and hears everything we're saying, I suppose, and will soon be introduced to him in an audio-visual manner when he presents. First is Neil Mutluer, who is Philip Schwartz Fellow at the Humboldt Universität currently. Is that true?
No, currently.
Currently? Sorry, that's the past already.
At the Law and Gender Studies Department.
In the Gender Studies Department. Sorry, I'm out of order. Sorry about that. Oh, I see. I need to read from my sheet. This is new. Okay. Has worked on internal displacement and the everyday life of Kurdish men in Istanbul. She's done field work and published extensively on gender, ethnicity, and religion and their intersection in Turkish democratization. She has also been quite active in a variety of civil society organizations and is a media personality. Or has been in the past. She was, until February of 2016, the head of the sociology department at
University
in Istanbul. But as a signer of the peace petition, we will not be party to this crime, was dismissed from her position, and was awarded the Philip Schwartz Fellowship in Diversity in the Diversity and Social Conflict Department at the Humboldt Universität, and is now interim professor of public law and gender studies at Humboldt Universität. Our second speaker, Yassin, is sitting immediately to my right, Yassin Al-Haj Saleh, who is currently a fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin and was a founding member of the Al-Haj group that thinks and writes about Syrian affairs since 2012. He was, earlier in life, for 16 years, a political prisoner during the regime of Hafez Assad, and is the author of 6 books about Syrian politics, political economy, identity, and his own experience as a dissident and political prisoner, including most recently a reflection on the events of and since the so-called Arab Spring, the Impossible Revolution. The first of his works, if I'm not mistaken, to be translated into English, although
English, Spanish
and French, but yes. And our third speaker, but second in order, Hamzawy, studied political science and development in Cairo and The Hague and Berlin, was previously professor of political science at the Cairo University and of public policy at the American University in Cairo. He has served as a senior fellow in the Middle East program and the Democracy and the Rule of Law program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. His research and teaching interests and academic publications focus on democratization in Egypt, the tensions between freedom and repression in Egyptian public space, political movements and civil society. He's currently working on a new book on contemporary Egyptian politics entitled Egypt's New Authoritarianism. And also, and crucially, given our three aims here, not just to provide analytic and conceptual clarity, as well as deep comparative and, in principle, hopefully global contextualization of the concepts of liberalism and democracy, but also a sense of what can be done in the face of what is a recognizable crisis for a certain sort of constitutional democracy across the world, is a political actor, a former member of the People's Assembly, and a former member of the Egyptian National Council for Human Rights. So, with all this rich experience, thematically, the what of what will follow over the next 80 minutes or so is first a presentation entitled Democratization as Tactic and Strategy during the AKP period from Neil.
Thank you for all of you. I'd like to thank Bard and Hertie College for members for making such a stimulating and inspiring discussion possible. Because I also feel that we needed such a discussion as a member of, or let's say, as coming from Turkey and quite active in the Turkish democratization process. We feel the disappointment at the first hand. So it's good to collectively think about how to define or conceptualize it and how to look at the future. So that's why I'd like to, before giving, or let's say, I'd like to continue our previous discussion, and I'd like to give a reference to Christian Lambert's points. I mean, when he says that people do not vote for the populist, but for the anti-establishment. I think while giving Turkey the background of the Turkish historical, moment, I can say that I'm not an economical expert, but politically and culturally, I can say that it is the case in Turkey. Now, today I'm going to focus on the tactics and the strategies during the AKP era, how it uses democracy as a tactic, while they're creating its tactics, and then as a strategy maker. But before this, I'd like to give some moments. You know that, when we're talking about Turkey and its relationship with democracy, we know that it's full of coups, you know, so it's coups in plural. So we have pluralism approaching coups, unfortunately. So in this respect, I cannot say that it has ever been a heaven for democracy, and especially, when the AKP first came to power in 2002, we know that it's especially with the wind of EU accession process, we witnessed that, all the pluralist values, social movements and identity politics, they're all in the air, and AKP has the chance to be active, because we know that when we look at the Turkey's establishment, political establishment, it is Kemalism, and it was constituted, formed against Islamism, which is also heterogeneous, it's not a homogeneous movement, and Kurdishness. Then Kurdish movement is also, now we are talking about Kurdish movement, but Kurdish society is not homogeneous itself as well. So in this respect, I can say that it comes as a reaction against the establishment of Kemalism. And during that time also we see that, Kurdish movement was also started to become very active. So, and one more point, when it first came to the power, Chief Prosecutor called the Constitutional Court to close down the AKP because of its political activities, especially the political activities of Erdogan. But somehow this demand rejected, and this also is a very new thing for Turkey during 2000s. And also, as I mentioned the coup, I think it's also important to one point, as we also give reference to the Gülen movement as well. 1980 coup was a very special moment in Turkish history. On the one hand, we know that it left no space for leftists around, and especially for the oppositional Islamists too. But on the other hand, and also we know that it is after 1980 coup, in 1984, it was the National Security Council who banned the, for instance, headscarf of women, I mean, women students who wants to enter to university. So which created the first time in Turkish society the embodiment of the polarization between the secularists and Islamists. Because even though we are, it can be, I mean, very critical, I mean, capitalist policies can be, we can criticize them as well in terms of the way they embodied, you know, the identity of the ideal Turkishness, but it never ever bent the attire of the women. It was clever enough not to touch the woman, but change the woman's, men's, you know, attires. I think it has a very symbolic value because it directly represents this polarization of the headscarf and anti-headscarf issue. But at the same time, after this 1980 coup, on the one hand, you may think that people are anti-Islamist. It was the 1980 coup bureaucrats opened a space to the Fethullah Gülen movement's establishment in the state bureaucracy. So in this respect, I mean, on the one hand, we can say that Erdogan is good at, and still is good at, representing itself as the new, but it used to have very close connections with the establishment through Gülen and other Islamist movements. And now, as they are not, as they have conflict with the Gülen movements because of various and clash of interests, now they become the enemy. But now he's in cooperation with all these coup generals, which he used to accuse of making coups and which opened what is called courts against them as the responsibles of the coup. So why I'm telling it, I think that's why this idea of people's voting tendencies against the establishment is represented as a populism tool in the Turkey. But when you look at the practice, especially in the war against Kurdish region or Kurdish movement or what's going on in the Kurdish region or the war in Afrin, you see that Erdogan managed to consolidate all the nationalist elements there. So this is the background information. So let me start with how AKP used a tactic and strategy. I don't want to go into the details of this theory, but I basically use De Sarto's approach. I don't know whether you are familiar with it, but I'm quite interdisciplinary, so that's why I prefer to use it. And I see that, I mean, according to De Sarto, strategy makers are mainly the state, business, army, city, and institutions. But as De Sarto is quite Foucauldian, it says that others, the cities of the people or the citizens, have also the power to create tactics against these strategies. So that's why I say that when Erdogan began its period, it was more a tactic creator against the establishment, who is a strategy maker. But then within time we see that it turns out to be a strategy maker itself. And we can also say that when it first came to power, it concentrated mainly on life, freedom and democracy. So I mean, I think the biggest example can be given by his statement in 2002. I mean, as an Islamist, as a Muslim, I mean, an Islamist politician, he dared, and as you can imagine, how homophobic can the Turkish, you know, political atmosphere be, as many places. He openly defends the rights of the homosexuals. I mean, homosexual rights and freedoms should be legally protected. We don't find it human to discriminate against homosexuals. And then during that time, it was the LGBTI movement which made this poster. Because so that's how we have started the AKP period, with the promise of these freedoms. So and of course he also, I mean, offered he demanded the release of the ban of the headscarf issue. And when you look at the gender issues, other gender issues, we see that, I mean, it is in his time that AKP passed law, again, I mean, civil law and penal code, which equalizes women in various aspects. So it happens in his term, but I should also give the credit to the very strong and pluralistic, I mean, women's movement, which includes, I mean, Kemalist to Kurds, I mean, lesbians, so it's a very trans people. So, and I think it is that push that makes them, that they have to pass it. So, and at the same time, when we look at the, you know that now there is a huge problem in Turkey about the rise of increase in the woman murders. And it's the first time it was the Erdogan government, the AKP government, which also passed the laws against, I mean, to protect the family and to fight against the violence against women. However, after 2011, which I think it was also the time, I mean, when we were talking with Elena, I mean, she said that, I mean, in her presentation, she leave Turkey out, but I think in the break we talked about it. We see that, I mean, Turkey has a tendency, especially after it was elected after the second time, and I think it's not only the internal dynamics or his obsession of power that he wants to change, but he also sees that with France and Germany's, you know, prevention of Turkey's membership to EU also makes him turn to East. So that's why, I mean, he needs new partners. So, and he realizes that once he got the majority, he also has the chance to carry on in his own way. And in one of the binary, so that's why, I mean, he carried on doing such binary oppositions. I mean, from gender issue, I want to move to Kurdish issue. In one case of this, one example of this binary opposition, I mean, tactical, let's say, examples that can be, or one example that can be presented as how Erdogan used this Kurdish issue as tactic and strategy during the just before, around the peace process. There was this state-induced massacre where 34 civilians, these civilians were border traders, were killed in December 27, 2011. And after, of course, there are huge demonstrations after that, because on the one hand you are talking about peace process, but on the other hand, I mean, your state killing, kills, I mean, Kurdish citizens. But as a reaction to this demonstrations, I mean, all of a sudden in the UN's Demography and Development Conference, Erdogan says that each abortion is uludere. So, I mean, he refrained from pronouncing a formal apology for the deaths of Roboski victims, I mean, who are Kurdish citizens of Turkey. So, I mean, the equation of established between the killing of Kurds at Roboski and abortion also allowed Erdogan to appease the Turkish nationalist sensitivities. So, all of a sudden, we see that, I mean, on the one hand, it positioned women as a second-grade citizen, and at the same time, Kurds as a second-grade citizen. That that an apology, I mean, is not needed to be given. And Kurdish issue is perhaps the area which witnessed the most, you know, visible swing from AKP, from life to death. And in this issue area, AKP government took bold steps, you know, that no other government in the Turkish Republic did. I mean, it started direct negotiations with Öcalan, which is the head of the PKK, and even mobilized public support by calling these negotiations a peace process. So these are big developments. And this was the closest that Turkey ever got into life in this issue area. So, I mean, this peace, pro-life issue used as a tactic, I mean, in this sensitive moments. But paradoxically, it turned out that it was also the point where we witnessed the most radical approach to death. So, I mean, peace and democracy was used as a tactic, and death and oppression as strategy. And seeing that the pro-Kurdish HDP and its popular leader Demirtas are serious rivals for the Kurdish votes, and that with the support of leftists and libertarians, they had the potential to topple down the AKP. Then with the majority votes in the parliament, Erdogan put an end to the peace process. And abruptly, I mean, especially after November 2015 elections, an unprecedented war started in the Kurdish region. And it was as if the peace process has never ever been, happened. Prolonged curfews, demolition of entire neighborhoods, and even cities and mass killings of civilians became commonplace in southeastern parts of Turkey. As you can see, I mean, this summer 2016, it's the moment that we academics for peace signed peace petition, and it's after that, I mean, as you see, it's like a war field, but it's a one city in Turkey. But you see that, I mean, all of a sudden he decides to destroy and put pressure on the city and demolished many areas. And the other area that Erdogan also, I mean, pushed from life to death, or from, use this democracy as a tactic and strategy, or and from inclusion to exclusion of the groups are, I mean, related with the Alevis. Do you know who Alevis are? Alevis are, I mean, and also maybe another additional information about the Turkish laicism, because on the one hand, it's always represented as an ideal Muslim role model, a secular role model, but on the other hand, from the very beginning, since 1925, there is a presidency of religious affairs, which represents all the mosques in the Turkey. So, which means that, I mean, on the one hand, we are talking about Muslim majority, but a Muslim majority whose religion is also regulated by the state. First things first, and secondly, we are talking about a secular state. But if you are not Muslim, like you can be Armenian, Greek, Jewish, you are considered as minority, and if you are Alevi, I mean, then the state thinks that you can be assimilated into the category of Islam, Sunnism. So Alevis were as they tried to be assimilated, they couldn't even use the word Alevi in their institutions since 2000s. So it's a big step, I mean, for AKP. To start an opening process for Alevis. So even he did this Erdogan and the AKP took this step in its time, and until the election of the Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, who's an Alevite leader, and who's an Alevi, becomes the main leader of the opposition party, CHP. And AKP gave up all the hopes to win over Alevi votes, and plus the war with Syria during that time started, and then AKP started to pursue an anti-Assad, foreign policy. They used to be very close friends, and then also, I mean, Erdogan started to stigmatize the Alevi communities, especially in the border cities with Syria, as Nusayris. And in my fieldwork in Alevis, I remember they say that, I mean, since the Ottomans, whenever they start to call us Nusayris, something big is coming up. So that's their, let's say, the memory that comes, I mean, from centuries-long experience. So in this respect, during the Gezi period, there was this Gezi uprising. Erdogan decided to call the third big bridge of the cities, Bosphorus, which is going to be established, about to finish, or finished anyway. We are all against this, and because, I mean, many environmental activists was highly critical to it, and he decided to say that it's going to be named as Yavuz Sultan Selim, the name of the Ottoman Sultan who was the perpetrator of the mass massacres of the Alevites in the history of Asia Minor. So which means that, I mean, he's good at using, on the one hand, he makes the opening, he gives the floor But on the other hand, if anything oppositional comes, because especially during the Gezi uprising, Alevi neighborhoods were very active against, and there are many people killed during that time from these neighborhoods. So all of a sudden, he changed his stand and use it as he decides that he has the power and he can make the strategy, and decides to put Yavuz Sultan Selim to the third bridge of Turkey. And of course, this is one of the Alevi platforms in East Turkey. And they say that we condemn that the name Cruel Yavuz, killer of Alevi Kızılbaş, to be given to the third bridge. And Gezi moment was I think a very exceptional moment in not only in Turkish history, because throughout my colleagues who studied social movements realized that there is no such movement in history, because it's not organized by anybody. And I was there. I was breastfeeding there, so I was a 2 months old mother during that time. My baby was 2 months old. So, and you see that all these groups, from the establishment, but now the establishment becomes the AKP itself, and all the anti-groups were very active in this. And for instance, the one moment which I like most, there are football hooligans and LGBTI and feminist groups tried to make a workshop with them for their sexist language, for instance. So, and it was really a moment, okay? Anyway, but of course, this was also the moment where Erdogan decides to openly state its openly started to polarize the society. So I can say that, in a Agamben sense, the way he uses Schmidt's, concept of state of exception, it's not only the constitutional things, but it's, de facto, he creates, state of exception moments, but after that, Erdogan started to amend security law and communication law in 2014, and then whether it switches to the jurisdiction, legal, whether it is legal or not, he carries on diminishing the civil space. And then we have another historical moment, which I think the polarization goes extreme, and now we have Fethullah Gülen people as the new enemies, which used to be the quite close, let's say, group with the AKP. And there was this failed coup attempt with executive decrees have placed the law and the constitution. And with the April 2017 presidential referendum, Erdogan's word has become effective the law of the country now. And the upcoming snap elections in 2018 is the last chance for opposition. It's going to be in June. Opposition to overturn the de facto dictatorship under which Turkey has been living for the last couple of years. And here I use the word dictatorship on purpose. Normally I refrain to use such words, but now we are all the time talking about, today, for instance, I heard, 2 people in prison are, died today because of they couldn't reach the health services that they need to be given. So now there is not any kind of approach that supports the life. And if, however, Erdogan wins the presidency again and the AKP wins the majority of the seats in parliament, which seems to be more likely the scenario, the last remnants of the separation of powers will be officially eradicated, and Turkey will become officially not only de facto but also de jure dictatorship this time. And this means that there would remain no constitutional, legal, or political obstacle on Erdogan's path to keep his promise of reinstating death penalty. And so he says that, and this is how I think the populism also works here as well. He goes back, from defending minority rights to talking about the majority's will. Don't worry, death penalty is coming soon, very soon. I hope our government will bring it to the parliament. I believe the parliament will pass it, and when it comes to me for my approval, I'm going to approve it. If the sovereignty belongs to the nation, then the case is closed. It's not what the West says, you know, the ideal enemies, and it's what my nation says that is important. And one note, we should keep in mind that death penalty was also abolished during AKP period in 2004. And Turkey ratified the protocol number 13 to the European Convention on Human Rights, overseen by the Council of Europe. So that's I try to, you know, be in the limit. That's why I was very quick, but we can carry on in the Q&A session. Thank you.
I'm truly happy to join you. I'm grateful for technology. I would have loved to be in Berlin, but we're having our annual conference here at Stanford at Political Science Department in the same 2 days you guys picked up for the conference. So I would have loved to have more of a direct exchange, but technology enables me to join in. So I take it based on the presentation of my colleague, the first speaker. So I'll try to share my ideas in anywhere between 15 and 20 minutes, hopefully more 15 and less 20. So the case I'm presenting is the Egyptian case. However, I am not going to engage in in explaining or analyzing what the ruling establishment since the coup of 2013 has been doing in the sense of building that new authoritarianism, which Michael kindly referred to as the title of my new book on Egypt. I'm not going to engage in explaining the different strategies, tools, policies which the new authoritarian ruling establishment has been using and implementing to basically drive back Egyptian politics and social activism to not only a point in time which preceded the democratic uprising in 2011, but actually to drive it back to a point in time which takes Egypt back to conditions which were prevailing in the 1950s and 1960s, where back then in the 1950s and 1960s we had the first coup, the first army coup in 1952, which toppled the monarchical regime and established a republic, but an authoritarian republic. And an authoritarian republic which was basically based on a one-man show. Back then, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who ruled Egypt between 1952 and 1970. I'm not going to dwell, of course, in the Q&A. If you have any questions, I'm happy to tackle them. But I'm actually more interested today in explaining how that authoritarian drive of the ruling establishment has been promoted, not only assisted or pushed forward, has been rightly promoted by liberal, intellectual, and political elites. And in doing so, I have three elements in my presentation which I'm going to share with you. The first one is basically to give you a rough map of what exactly am I referring to when I say liberal, intellectual, and political groups in Egypt. What exactly am I referring to? So a quick mapping of these liberal forces. Secondly, I'm going to share with you some ideas on how they have been promoting the rise of the new authoritarianism. I refer, as Michael kindly mentioned in his brief introduction, I refer to grand deceptions. These are basically conceptual and analytical, sometimes pseudo-philosophical, sometimes pseudo-sociological, but these are tools, discursive tools, which liberal elites have been pushing forward to promote the new authoritarianism. So I'm going to dwell on these grand deceptions for a bit, and finally I'm going to share some ideas on why. So why is it that liberal forces in Egypt have come to be more supportive of authoritarian governments? And once again, after the democratic uprising and the brief experiment which we did have in Egypt between 2011 and 2013 in democratizing, how come they switched side very quickly from championing a democratic order for Egypt right after the uprising in 2011 into falling back to their default position of promoting an authoritarian pattern of government. Now, first of all, to my first point, mapping. And arguably, one can always say that liberal ideas, as we know them, in comparison to the West or in comparison to other regions of the world, found their first articulation in Egypt towards the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And those who were engaged back then in articulating liberal ideas were primarily a group of intellectuals, all the way from religious scholars to graduates of the modern educational system, which was being established back then in the second half, roughly in the second half of the 19th century. This was historically the first intellectual articulation of liberal ideas. Liberal ideas back then were focused in their first intellectual articulation on, to my mind, two key elements. Number one, to try to figure out a different way of organizing the relationship between religion and the state, religion and public order. And secondly, the second key element was trying to create a space, not only in relation to religion, but also in relation to authority, a space for personal freedoms. Be it we're referring to freedom of religion, or freedom of expression, or freedom of association. These freedoms were perceived as key individual freedoms, and there was an attempt to create some discursive space, and moving from that discursive space into a societal space for these freedoms. This was in the second half of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. A second remarkable phase began in 1919 in Egypt with a popular uprising, a revolution, as we call it in Egyptian historiography, the 1919 revolution, which was basically a national independence revolution led by a group of liberal politicians, turned politicians. They were judges, they were writers, they were university professors, turned liberal politicians, and established what came to be Egypt's most popular political party, Al-Wafd, which had a clear liberal platform all the way between its establishment in the 1920s and 1952, a liberal platform in which, besides that engagement in ideas about religion and politics, religion and state, and the search for personal freedoms, an attempt was made consciously to carve out a space for liberal political ideas where conceptions of citizenship, equality among citizens, regardless of religious identity in Egypt, Muslims and Coptic Christians, this space was carved out and sustained with, in fact, great popularity by the Wafd party in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. That experiment, this first incarnation of liberal ideas, comes to an abrupt end in the 1950s with a military coup performed by a group of young officers called the Free Officers. And then we move on from the 1950s all the way to 2011 into a pattern of an authoritarian rule. Of course, here I don't have time to share the details. But basically, what happened from the 1950s onward to liberal ideas was twofold. One, the political space was cancelled altogether. There was no space for a liberal political party to do what political parties do, in the sense of competing in elections seriously or reaching out to constituencies, and that political space which was carved out before 1952 diminished altogether, and diminished quickly. So it took the Free Officers 2 years, between 1952 to 1954, to cancel the partially democratic experiment of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And secondly, philosophically liberal groups became more engaged in less experimenting with ideas about how to reframe the relationship between religion and the state, and became more engaged in issues pertaining to economic models and economic development, and especially in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, this was the high time of Egypt's experiment with a socialist-driven economy. And so the value of liberal forces tackling grand ideas on how to reorganize state-religion relations and so on, and figure out a place for religion, society, and politics was diminished as well. On the ground, liberal forces lost their constituencies, lost their popular backing, and they in fact saw the original discourse being taken over in many different ways by other forces. Even to an extent by religious-based forces. Some Islamist forces were coming in the 1950s, 70s, 80s, 90s to champion more that push for opening up Egyptian politics, even a defense for political freedoms, not personal freedoms, and liberals were withering away. We come to 2011, and here we have a democratic moment, an interesting moment, the democratic uprising of January 2011 and its aftermath. And here we saw some attempts by liberal forces to one, reorganize in old and new political parties. So Al-Waqf party, which I was referring to, became more relevant after 2011. New liberal parties emerged. There was a bit of organization in civil society even before 2011. Young groups, civil society activists, human rights groups with a clear liberal commitment, a commitment to an idea of liberal democracy. And there was an attempt even within liberal groups to reach out across the ideological aisle to leftist groups, nationalists, and so on and so forth, as well as to Islamists. This brief experiment comes to an end in 2015 with the second military coup on July 3rd, 2013. Now, my story here, so the map we're looking at is a map of, sociologically speaking, weak actors, weak collective action platforms, primarily parties, civil society groups, groups of intellectuals and writers. Some of them are influential, but collectively we're not speaking about a giant movement on the ground, not comparable to the two real giants of Egyptian politics, which is the military security establishment on the one hand and Islamists on the other hand. So in a way, weak forces, as weak as leftist groups, have come to be in Egypt as well. So the second part of my presentation is what kind of grand deceptions have liberals engaged in to promote and push forward the new authoritarianism. I'm referring to the current authoritarianism, describing it as a new authoritarianism, because there are key differences between the current style of rule in Egypt and what we had before 2011, the autocracy of former President Mubarak or the president who preceded him. There are key differences which make me convinced that we can term what is happening, unfolding right now, as a new authoritarian rule, in the sense of how they use key tools and elements of the state, all the way from lawmaking to shaping state-sponsored discourses, but that is beside the point now, and once again we can dwell on it on the Q&A if there is any interest. Now, my question is, what kind of grand deceptions have these sociologically weak liberal forces engaged in to promote the new authoritarianism, which cancelled the democratic experiment, which came after 2 years, even a bit more than 2 years, in which Egyptian citizens were out there in the public space, at least trying to embrace a new form of doing politics and trying to carve out spaces for more freedom, politically, civil freedoms, as well as personal freedoms. These were vibrant years, and when you compare Egypt of those years to Egypt of today, I mean, you see, at least, I mean, you will have to come to a quick assessment of, well, it seems this new authoritarianism is working out very nicely, quote unquote, of course, very nicely. I mean, the reality is depressing, with a great deal of human rights violations, but it's working because repression works, because prisons work, because intimidation works, and activism is no more. So this is a different country, at least at the surface of it, at least when it comes to formal political arenas. The grand deceptions liberals have been engaged in are 5, and I'm going to refer to them quickly in a headline manner. The first grand deception, which was articulated before the summer of 2013, was that basically reviving an old discussion of are Egyptians ready to democracy? And this was quite surprising. I mean, that readiness to democracy argument used to come from the autocratic ruling establishment all the way from the 1950s to 2011. And that question of readiness to democracy was responded to negatively, evoking all kinds of matters, all the way from the Arab-Israeli conflict to lack of education, to high illiteracy and poverty and unemployment rates, and so on and so forth. The first grand deception liberal forces engaged in before the summer of 2015 and right after it to basically push for a cancellation of the democratic experiment was basically, we're not ready for democracy. And it was surprising to see key liberal voices before 2013 saying that, well, you know, when we go to the polls, votes of educated Egyptians should not be equal to votes of uneducated Egyptians. So they were engaged in circulating all kinds of anti-liberal, illiberal, which is a reason one of the reasons for the title of my presentation. All kinds of illiberal ideas, but coming down to that issue of we're not ready for democracy and we've got to wait. And here liberals were in fact re-owning or a discourse which was invented by the autocratic ruling establishment in the 1950s in cancelling the previous democratic experiment. So they revived that discourse and shaped it across more contemporary lines, saying that, well, look at what the polls gave Egyptians. They gave Islamist majorities, parliamentary and presidential.
50 minutes is up.
Am I back? Are you still hearing me?
Yes.
Okay, so this must be a conspiracy.
Somebody didn't like that.
A liberal,
Yeah, somebody
illiberal.
didn't quite like that. I'm used to it. So, but anyhow, so one, responding to the question of the readiness of democracy negatively, re-owning that old discourse of the 1950s and 1960s. A second grand deception is basically trying to frame the question of democracy as in contradiction to key national needs. Be it you frame those national needs as national security, driven by what's happening in the region, and my dear friend Yassin is going to tell us more about the Syrian case, but in reference to what's happening in the region, look at Syria, look at Libya, look at Iraq. I mean, we do not want Egypt to slip in that direction, and democracy is no good. So democracy in contradiction to that need of preserving the state, sustaining national security, or even democracy in contradiction to basically keeping state institutions up and running. So here too, a second grand deception was to frame the democratic experiment or any attempt to democratize, any attempt to grant citizens more rights and freedoms in contradiction to key national needs. And of course, the weight of this formulation, the national need, is pressing. I mean, of course, you compromise for national needs. And here, a devaluation of the very idea, the very liberal essence of what democracy is all about, which is basically to enable citizens to choose and to find their own compromises without compromising on national security, on the stability of the state, has been hugely undermined. And this to enable the new authoritarianism to cancel the democratic experience. A third deception, which is not only shared by liberals, but it's across a very wide spectrum in Egypt, which is that search for a messiah, for a savior. So it's in the Egyptian political history, it's eminent in leftist writings because of the 1950s and 1960s and the value of the former Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser. I mean, that search for a savior, most probably a savior in uniform, a messiah in uniform. It was quite surprising that here too liberal forces, which apparently were very challenged by their weakness in the polls between 2011 and 2013, tried to re-own the discourse of Egypt is waiting for a messiah, for a savior, and it's always a savior in uniform. Re-own it to figure out ways of devaluing the very idea, the very essence of what liberal democracy is all about, which is creating a set of representative institutions, rule of law, and rotation of power. Because with a savior, there is no need to address rule of law. With a savior, there is no need to address representative democracy. The Messiah does not restrict his capabilities and his outreach and his grand steps to representative institutions or to any regulations of the rule of law. Here too, this is a discourse which was not originally liberal in the Egyptian setting, and here liberals of the last years re-owned a discourse which was invented by leftist groups, championed to an extent by autocratic ruling establishment before 2011. A fourth grand deception is very much related to religion and politics, but not in the sense of where the origination of liberal ideas was to carve out a new space, a new relationship between religion and the state, religion and politics. Here, liberal forces, liberal groups, basically had a quick answer of, well, I believe they deconstructed liberal democracy to basically a set of two poles, and they went in the direction of one pole and ignored the other completely. So they simplified what liberal democracy is all about. Of course, after all the cancellations I was just referring to separating religion from the state on the one hand, and secondly, enabling citizens to participate in politics freely. And they employed a sequential idea of, let's fix that issue of religion, separate religion from the state, and that can only be done by a powerful autocratic ruling establishment. And when we have that fixed and figured out, we can then figure out how to empower citizens once again. Because when you get citizens, the answer was, when you get citizens into politics, into the fore, they will always go in the direction of religious movements. This is what the culture is. This is what, of course, all of this is pseudo-sociological analysis, which cannot be substantiated. But anyhow, this is how they do it. So appropriating a pseudo-sequential argument to say that, well, what's important right now is to figure out how to separate religion from politics. Finally, the state vision, and here, goodbye to liberal ideas and ideals as we know them from liberal movements. Well, I mean, I have to relativate, because right now, when you look around, even in Europe, and once again, I mean, liberal parties and movements are doing all kinds of funny stuff, which is, I believe, what we've been looking at. But the state vision of liberal groups, their vision for the state, is very much anti-liberal in essence. It's not about a small state, it's about a giant state. It's about a state which is out there to do it all, to get it all right for a citizen. So it's a state, it's a father state. It's a state which is a patriarchal state. It's a state which is out there to take care of all our needs, and so we delegate our right, our freedom of choice to the state. This is a very different state than what you would expect from liberal groups, and even within that, a second important layer is what happened as far as liberals are concerned within the state apparatus. So they have come to favor a strong executive as opposed to a viable, strong, independent legislative and judicial authority, and in doing so, in putting forward the dominance of the executive idea, they were backing and promoting the new authoritarianism, which is in reality based on the supremacy of the executive branch of government and the complete weakness of the legislative and the judicial branches of government. So here too, this new authoritarian reality has been promoted by liberal forces. Finally, the third component of my presentation, why? So why is it? Where does it come from? And here I have very briefly three quick reasons which I'm going to share. One, basically historical legacies matter. Liberal forces in Egypt since the 1950s have not experienced what is it like to compete in an open space, in an open market of ideas, or in a political open market. They were refrained. They were banned from competition because of the dominance of the autocracy. There was no free space in university, public or private universities. There was no free space in the media. There was no free space in politics. And so liberals did not know how to compete. They had no space to compete, to articulate ideas, to test them, to see whether they resonate or not. And so they came to 2011 and post-2011 in a structurally weakened manner. They were not sure of whether there is value to what they are saying, popular value or not philosophical, of course they believe in it, but popular value. Can they organize constituencies or not? And add to that, to that issue of historical legacies matter, the very fact that liberals have seen how the Egyptian society evolved from the 1970s onward in the direction of more and more significance of religious forces and religious ideas which were penetrating the public space and whatever space was out there, from civil society to media, and sometimes sponsored by the state for tactical purposes, sometimes sponsored by ruling establishments for tactical purposes, and sometimes not. So the historical legacy of weakness vis-a-vis the autocracy and vis-a-vis Islamist forces has been dominant in explaining illiberal behavior of liberal groups in Egypt. The second reason is, I would say, and predominantly the network of patronage. The network of patronage which the Egyptian autocracy since the 1950s has been able to shape. A patronage which basically made it very clear, has always made it very clear to liberal forces that unless they ally to the state, they stand no chance of playing a role, a significant role intellectually or in participation in public debates, or of course in participation in politics. To the extent that the current political situation we're looking at is a situation where the autocracy in Egypt grants weak liberal parties which are pro-state, pro-president, pro-government seats in the legislative authority, or a minor representation in the cabinet, or some representation of their ideas in the media or in the educational system, and so on and so forth. This dependency, structural dependency on the state, liberals did not try to break away from it because they did not organize away from the state. Islamists tried their hands for some time until 2013, and they were dependent, Islamists were dependent on the social capital and on the religious faith, and liberals had no access to both of them. They had no social capital to put forward, they had no assets to do charity work, unlike Islamists, and they had no access to the religiously sanctioned space. So structural dependency on the state by means of explaining. Thirdly, I believe the third factor explaining the illiberal behavior of liberal groups is that this idea of how to manage religion, how to manage the relationship between religion and state, religion and politics, was never settled in modern Egyptian history in any clear or satisfactory manner for liberals. So that tension of let's focus first on getting that right and everything else can be pushed away, so that sequential idea which is being used now politically for autocratic purposes has some historical origin, has some relevance in how liberal forces, parties and movements view Egyptian reality. That fear of a religious takeover, that fear of an Islamist takeover, that fear of we will go to the ballot box for one time and never again. And of course that was pushed forward by, I'm not going to dwell on that, by different strategic and tactical mistakes committed by Islamists during the 2 years of the democratic opening, vis-a-vis Egyptian Copts or vis-a-vis issues pertaining to women, their status in society, or personal freedoms. So far on my side, let me stop here and thank you for your patience, and I'm of course very interested in following up with you in a Q&A and then listening to my dear friend Yassin. Thank you so much.
The title of my paper is New Liberalism and the Rise of Identity Politics in Syria. Actually, it is more about undemocratic liberalism than illiberal democracy. In Syria, the background, the social and the historical background is extremely different. In June 2005, the Ba'ath Party held a conference in Damascus, and a decision to liberalize the Syrian economy was taken without objection. This is remarkable because the Ba'ath Party is supposedly a socialist one. The formal name of the party is the the Socialist Arab Party, Ba'ath Party. The banner for this economic transformation was social market economy. You know that this was a concept adopted in Germany after the Second World War. And it was a reconciliation, sort of reconciliation between social or socialism and market, between state functions and market. But my argument is that there was a lot of market and so much less of society. Soon there were branches of banks in the central neighborhoods of the capital and other big cities, especially Damascus and Illiberal. And the average age of cars in the streets was 2 or 3 years, after decades of that average being 20 years or more. But more than 25 years, I think. Fancy restaurants, cafes, clothes shops were increasing in number, attracting pretty modern-looking young people. The first mall appeared in a very highly securitized district in Damascus, Kafr Sousa, where are so many security agencies. Elite schools and hospitals were opened, mostly in elitist, clean, well-protected suburbs around the capital. In short, there was so much market with less social in our SME, social market economy. This came few months after the forced withdrawal of Syrian troops from neighboring Lebanon that had been known of its open economy for generations. Rim Allaf, a Syrian writer and political commentator, came up at that time with a formula that picked well the meaning of the ongoing social and economic transformation. Beirutization of Damascus. This is the formula. Damascus was being Beirutized, becoming a Syrian Beirut, so to speak. I tend to understand this as installing an internal Beirut for those who were enjoying life in the lost paradise of Lebanon. Syria, there was Syrian occupation or intervention, to use a mild expression, between 1976 up to 2005, so almost 3 decades. But if we look closer, we may see other dynamics at work, and internal social ones for that. At that time, the Ba'ath Party was in power. At that time, I mean in 2005. Ba'ath Party was in power for 42 years, 35 among which under the Assad dynasty rule. You know how the Assad ruled Syria between 1970 up to 2000, and his son is still ruling us. The Socialist and Arab Nationalist Party and the dynasty never ruled a day without emergency laws in effect. This naked state of exception that Neil alluded to in regard to Turkey was the legal cover for what Marx called primitive accumulation. I mean a huge transfer by brute force of property, lands, public resources, human labor, free services that were the basis for what I call the new bourgeoisie in Syria. Human labor, I mean mainly soldiers in the army. They are used by officers in their farms or fancy castles, especially in the coastal area. They bring the soldiers and they irrigate, they water the land, they do so many works without being paid because they are soldiers and they are just serving our homeland, protecting our homeland. So the leading sector in this new class is deeply connected to those in power, with Rami Makhlouf, Bashar's cousin, maternal cousin, being the richest among them and their symbol. This ruling class is composed mostly of a generation of rich, elegant people who speak other languages, English in particular, beside Arabic. and whose average age is around 40, the age of Bashar himself at that time. They are called in Syria أولاد المسؤولين, which means literally the sons of the influential people in power. Their fathers were mostly in the intelligence or military, intelligence services or military, in the military or civil assistance to Hafez. The other phase of this project of developing and modernizing, this was one of the main slogans of Bashar era, تطوير and تعديل, which means developing and modernizing, and to give a modern appearance of the regime. In the days of the father, Syria has a very outdated, old socialist, dilapidated face. Bashar, who lived in London for almost 20 years to study ophthalmology, and his elegant wife, and she's still elegant and beautiful, and her shoes are silver. The last pair of shoes was brought to her from London by $7,000. They have been trying to give modern appearance to themselves and to the country and to the center of the capital. And I have to say that they have been successful. It was public relation campaign, very successful in the West. The other phase of this project of developing and modernizing, as it was called by the regime media organs, is that the peripheral neighborhoods and outskirts of the city, of cities, were rapidly deteriorating. Towns and rural areas suffered a lot from the mixture of a newly introduced economic liberalization and old liberalization according to Washington consensus. The new liberal formula. And all the rigid political authoritarianism. The slogan of the latter, of the political face of the regime, was stability and continuity. استقرار and استمرار, they rhyme in Arabic. استقرار means stability, which means that there should no political life and political strife and political parties. And استمرار means continuity. استمرار means that it is to legitimize the inheritance of the son, the post of his father. In 2004 and 31 of the Syrians lived on under $2 a day, and 11 under $1 a day. 11, a bit more than 2 million. The Syrians were at that time 20 or 21 millions. In 2007, the first number, 31%, rose up to 37. The region that was mostly stricken with poverty was the northeastern part of the country that came later to be located outside useful Syria. To make things worse, this region suffered from 4 consecutive drought years from 2007 to 2010, with 1,300,000 affected by this condition. 300,000 families. These economic and social changes, coupled with unchanging political theory, led to the activation of inherited identities. This was clear in the election of the People's Council, Majlis Sha'b, which is our parliament, in 2007. Independent candidates, which is 1/3 of the 250 members of People's Council, are independent. The 2/3 are the quota of Ba'ath Party and other smaller subordinate parties, two among which are communist parties. We have two communist parties allied to the Ba'ath Party. And we have two against the regime. I was a member in one of them. Independent candidates were just showing their names, images, and origins, tribal or family origin. The 2/3 who are guaranteed share of the Ba'ath Party and other smaller independent parties were just praising the regime and the leader. Their election was guaranteed. The 2/3 of the Ba'ath and we call it in Syria National Progressive Front, Jabhat al-Taqaddumiyya, will be elected, whatever you pick. They are always guaranteed to be elected. No one of them failed in, I guess, since 1973, the first elections. Their election was guaranteed, so they did not even bother to display their images. The People's Council has no political role, but it is the formal space where vitamin wow is produced and distributed. Vitamin wow, from wasta in Arabic. Wasta means mediation, that you talk in favor of someone for some services, for some exceptions. Vitamin wow is popular Syrian idiom for the role of influential people, for all influential people play on behalf of their relatives or those who pay them. They are keys, we use this word in Syria, key, miftah, or back, they are back, that support, or yad'amun, which means give support to those who need to be supported. If you are not supported, if you don't have a key or vitamin wow or back, you are a hopeless case. You can think or would not. Or they are influential persons that provide you with illegal exceptions from rules, or just mediate for you to secure access to some services without so much bureaucratic hindrance. I mean, you need maybe to build an extra room, or to have electricity power in your house, or to get a passport. You have to, even these legal everyday needs, you need wasta for that. You need vitamin wow. I have never had passport because it is not something routine to have a passport in Syria. And I guess 80% of the Syrians have never had passports. So it is not a routine thing. A German is the one with a German passport. In Syria, no. A Syrian is the one who ruled by the Assad family. So, vitamin wow providers make, in the People's Council and so many other spaces, I mean, mostly security officers, military officers, ministers, religious people. Among Christians, bishops are providers of vitamin wow for their communities. Among the Alawis, security officers and military officers. Among the Sunnis, clerks, religious people and rich people. Among the Druze, also religious people or some influential people. In tribal Syria, Raqqa and other regions, tribe sheikhs. Among the Kurds, some people who are co-opted by the regime, and of some tribal also persons. So vitamin wow providers make a dominated sector in the new bourgeoisie, because the dominant sector is those who don't mediate. Rani Makhlouf don't mediate. Rani Makhlouf can just put his hand on big companies being an agent for big international corporations. So this is the dominant sector of this new bourgeoisie. So the vitamin wow providers make a dominating sector in the new bourgeoisie, whose role is to mostly confined within their communities. It is almost unimaginable that a Christian, for instance, will act as a vitamin wow provider to a Sunni, or a Kurd, or a Druze will mediate for a Alawi or something. So this encourages, and this is my point, how neoliberalism is encouraging identity politics. This encourages people to come closer to their religious leaders, or to confine their lives to within their communities. The demand on this vitamin has been there all the time during the decades of the Assad family rule, but it towered after SNE turn in 2005. This is partly because the popular organizations of the Ba'ath Party, like Revolutionary Youth of Syria, all the young people in the country, Women Union, Workers Union, Peasants Union, Students Union, were weakened. These populist popular organizations, and populist, they were the tools for populism in 1960s and 70s, and partly 80s. These were weakened, and the new class, the new bourgeoisie, replaced them with its institutional accessories. Among these accessories, the most important is the Syrian Organization for Development, which is headed by no less than Asma al-Akhras, Bashar's wife. She's now the face of our civil society. And it seems that Mr. de Mistura, our special envoy, is in love with the so-called civil society, Syrian civil society, and only recently they issued a very despicable manifesto, almost supporting the regime. Those organizations were in a way collective. I mean, the popular organizations, students, workers, peasants, were in a way vitamin wow provider, collective vitamin wow providers, so to speak, mediating between the center of power and those sectors of the population, popular sectors of the population, peasants, workers, students. This led to a higher dependence from the uninfluential majority on their relatives close to power centers, which in turn strengthened communitarian, tribal, sectarian, ethnic relations. However, Wasta second only to power, I mean by power being from the Assad family or an officer in the security, which is not available. Power is not available to many, especially among rural Sunni population where clientelism networks of Wasta were thin and weak. Actually, my analysis of sectarianism in Syria and I guess in Lebanon is that they are not about religion. They are about they are networks of clientelism. They are communities to provide services and to provide protection at the same time. So it is not about religion. It is unimaginable because the system doesn't encourage you to mediate for someone alien to you. Why are you intervening for someone you are adversely? Why are you intervening for the Sunni guy? It is. We have so many stories about this. So the system is built around encouraging and pushing people to stay confined within their groups and to not come closer to other groups, other communities. So it is something that relates to economy, to to the political system. It is not about religion and mentalities and these issues of our friends who Amr was talking. It is not about that. The people mentality is backward and they don't understand. They are not secular. They are not enlightened. The rich can pay for services or exceptions, but money is not also available to many in progressively impoverished areas. So they are away from the centers of power, and they don't have money because of this impoverishment dynamic. Many people became at the same time vulnerable, angry, and prepared to radicalism. I'm not saying this in retrospect. I'm not wiser after the catastrophe. Actually, I wrote a paper about this titled on the probable social and political consequences of economic liberalization in Syria in 2008, about this, about radicalization and about the high probability of sectarian strife in the country. The Washington Consensus that was adopted in Assad Jr.'s Syria did not openly imply privatization of previously nationalized projects. All new ones were owned by private entrepreneurs. Exemplary among these, Syriatel. Syriatel is the main mobile phone corporation. A mobile phone company owned by Rami Makhlouf, the maternal cousin of Bashar. But one should take into consideration that the state itself was privatized since Bashar was installed in his deceased father's post. And we have to put in mind that this was impossible if it were not for killing at least 25,000 people in 1982 in Hama. Those among you who know something about the state of Syria, one third of the city was destroyed, and in a month, maybe 20 to 25,000 of its people were killed, and it was partly armed struggle against the Muslim Brotherhood at that time. The social functions of the privatized state suffered from a steep decline. In case there are public projects in one sphere, the private ones provide better services or goods and offer better salaries to those who were working for the public projects. This puts them in a better, privately owned projects, this puts them in a better competitive position. The state projects would soon be closed and sold out to private owners. In few years, private interests prevailed in the country, with their share of the GNP rose to more than 70% in 2008. Syria is an oil producer country, not very rich, but despite this, private projects were producing 70% of the GNP. The new privileged class control of information industry has its effects on the discourses and symbolism. Years before the Syrian uprising, there was displayed morbid attraction. These information industry outlets displayed morbid attraction to identities, communities, and modes of living. Modes of living defined in cultural terms, with two things in the center: veil and drinking alcohol, which is a way of indirect sectarianizing the debate in the country. Veil and women's dresses became topic of heated debate. On the high cultural level, theories that explain our political and social problems with mentality were massively produced and distributed. The public debate was sectarianized, though publicly talking about sectarianism itself remained a political taboo, strict political taboo actually. Before the Syrian revolution, the possible debate was effectively mystifying issues of class, power, and privilege. What identity politics was screening from public awareness was class politics, especially the process of the ascendance of the ferocious class, the new bourgeoisie. This is interesting from a historical point of view. Those who are from my generation know that in the 1960s and 1970s, a rigid Marxist discourse was actually mystifying some struggles that are related to sectarianism. Now it is the opposite. Sectarianism is mystifying the struggles related to class and to privilege and to power. To go back to Syria, the country is a classic example of privatized state with a modernist discourse and symbolism that finds a common cause with those who adopt a new liberal worldview in the West. Here too, in the West, we see the rise of identity politics and a crisis in democracy. Islamophobia rose irresistibly since 1990s. It has helped so many, in the West, again, to be blind to the war of extermination going in the country for more than 7 years now. The so-called war on terror is in turn mystifying racist tendencies, empowering those who are already powerful and mercilessly weakening those who are already weak and vulnerable. The prospect of reconstruction in Syria, which is a topic that Mr. de Mistura and other actors are trying to promote now, the prospect of reconstruction in Syria will most probably fall within this framework. Aggressively privatized economy with more foreign control on the Syrian public resources, aggressive and militant new sultanism. We don't have enough time to focus on this, but allow me to refer you to my book, The Possible Revolution. The last chapter of it is about the modern sultan, and I am discussing in details this new sultanic regime, which is also genocidal. And in this, maybe we can talk about dictatorship in Syria. I think you praise very much the Syrian regime, the Assad regime, when you call it dictatorship. This is the basis of misunderstanding Syria. We don't have a dictatorship, we have a genocidal regime. And dictatorships are problems of their countries, of their people. Erdogan and the AKP are a problem for the Turkish, or for the people in Turkey, the peoples in Turkey. Genocidal regimes are not. When there's a regime that is ready to kill people with chemical WMD and barrel bombs and systematic killing by torture, this is not a dictatorship. And this is too much for the Syrians to solve. This is a global problem. So, aggressive and militant new sultanism, extremely reactionary, though with a modernist discourse, and a war on terror that targets the marginalized more than the terrorist networks. By the way, the image that Neil displayed, Nusaybin, I think we have at least 100 places destroyed more than this. And it is not something related to even genocide. It is related to new liberalism, to reconstruction. And already there are laws and there are plans to reconstruct these regions. So this is again the link between neoliberalism, between identity politics, and between genocide. A regime of apartheid is what is being installed in Syria, a world in which the Syrian whites, the new bourgeoisie, and those who are the guards, the class of guards, the security people, and the Assad family, those are the Syrian whites, are protected from the Syrian blacks who live under surveillance, killed en masse when they rebel. In our part of the world, it is more relevant to talk about undemocratic liberalism, fascist indeed, and confined to the economic field and liberalism, rather than illiberal democracy. I am afraid that thinking of liberal deficiency in democracy may conceal a progressive crisis in democracy and even a process of democratization that's going on a global scale. The demos are in their weakest position since the Second World War, at least. Krasi is prosperous. And is protecting itself more and more. It seems that predictable future promises them of growing only weaker. I mean, the demos, that people. Thank you.
Amply demonstrated that in the region, and I can maybe to some extent identify myself with the region, we have a problem with borders and boundaries. And so obviously we're beyond time, but I think this was rich and so much contextualization offered. Maybe we can allow ourselves one round of questions if there are. And just collect 2, 3, 4, however many hands there are, and then one chance for replies, and then so we'll go from front to back.
Thank you. I have a question to Mutluer. The headline was democratization as tactic and strategy. So I wanted to come back on that. Do you think, would you say that Erdogan was a hypocrite in the beginning, or is it rather than that when he became establishment himself, he saw that those groups he was supporting in the beginning became a problem for himself, and was that the reason? So a pure power play, or was it hypocrisy right from the beginning?
So maybe let's just collect these and then for Matthias.
I have a question that occurred to me during Ms. Mutluer's presentation, but it's an open question for the panel, because it seems like these illiberal states, or most of them, are shifting away from liberal democracy, which they once had, or there was an attempt. And I wonder if this shift away from liberal democracy has an end point, or if a consolidation of these regimes is possible, or when it is possible, or it's an endless spiral and it has to go on and on until the point when we can, as you did, explicitly call the regime a dictatorship and beyond. So in other words, should I go home after finishing college? But yeah, so this is
Where are you?
So is a consolidation of these regimes possible, or do they have to be in a constant shift and a constant movement towards further authoritarianism?
There was one more in the back.
Yeah. It was kind of often referenced, but maybe not fully addressed, but kind of the topic of religion in the region, because I thought the same thing the last session as well. We were talking about the U.S. and this whole thing, but religion wasn't really addressed at all, and yet I think 100 million people in the United States identify as evangelical Christian, and I wonder if maybe the dismissal of religion is creating more problems than it's solving. Is there any good movements within religion?
Oh, one more in the front.
Is it okay? Well, it seemed the same. I was trying to find a common line of thought between the three presentations, so let me quickly run in. It's also in a way a response to the previous panel and its excessive focus on economic factors. It seems to me that what all three presentations here
Putative.
foreground is three different ways in which three regimes are co-opting or using strategically or tactically aspects of Western liberal society, promoting them in order to serve their own ends. In Erdogan, that is actually rights, that is minority rights, but I think the idea was to grant them and then retract them. But both in the case of Egypt and Syria, I think there is a moment, and maybe also in parallel time, of economic liberalization, of open doors, right, so to speak, which I'm sure is music to the West, right? So using that only to consolidate and in fact more effectively separate and rule, because that what Yassin described as sectarianism is actually how to deal with the pluralism which is already on the ground and use it to reinforce authoritarian tactics. I mean, this is not exactly a response to Amr's, but I'm wondering whether you find something like that, plausible.
I found it very complementary, the arguments. I didn't find them a contradistinction at all.
No, that was,
Shall we hear? Yeah. Amr, did you hear the questions at all? Okay.
I did.
Would you like to reply first? Do you mind?
I believe let my colleagues go first.
Okay.
In order not to.
I wanted to let you off the hook. Yeah.
No, I'm still awake. No worries.
So.
Shall I?
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, just let me start with this Hungary issue. I'm a graduate of Central European University. So when I was fired, they made a solidarity page for me, and then it was a couple of months later, it was me who tried to keep in solidarity with them, and I felt that there is no space in the world for me, no academy for me that represent any kind of democratic, liberal, pluralistic idea. So I understand what you mean, but this also shows that, I mean, this understanding that, I mean, on the one hand, we are talking it as dictatorships, and there's a huge hopeless scenario, but I think there are hopes going on there as well, because there is the resistance, or let's say the opposition still tries to create its own ways of being. And for instance, during the referendum, it was huge pressure against opposition in Turkey, I mean, in all ways. But for instance, women movements carry on opening stands every day. So, and or the other move. So I think it has its tactics are now both from, I mean, power relations still goes on. But of course, this doesn't mean that, I mean, we are talking about civil society, openness, democracy, reaching to the resources. So it's, unfortunately, it's not the state. But let me start with this. When I listened to Emir and Yassin, I mean, one and after, I feel myself in a travel of past and today. Because what, Emir, do you hear me?
I do.
Okay, because what you, and I realize that what we understand from liberal, or let's say, I mean, but not conceptually, but contextually, differs from one locality to another locality. Because when you summarize the points of liberals in Egypt, I thought, I really figured out the embodiment of a Kemalist, in Turkey, who is elitist, and close to, you say that, are they ready to democracy? So we shouldn't let, uneducated people to vote. So there should be a messiah, which is Atatürk. And state and religion should be separated, which is the secularism in Turkey. I mean, the Kemalist state secularism. The state vision, father, patriarchal state, it's the same thing, I mean, but it's everywhere. So, and the fear of Islam, Sharia, it's mazallah. I mean, you know what, if it comes. So that's why I think what I feel is when we come today, I mean, or let's say this, you call them as liberals, but in Turkey, I was called as liberal, and most of the time during 2000s, I was singled out because I'm quite critical to the Kemalists, who are for militarism, state, and anti-religious groups, etc. And this time it was the Kemalists, and I also come to this hypocrisy, point. For instance, Kemalists also calls us that, see, they did what they had in mind. And I say that even, a broken clock shows twice the right time a day. So what this mean? I mean, they are telling the same argument. So I don't know whether they are hypocrites, at the very beginning. I don't want to put them in this label, but I think it's the market economy, EU relations, and all this Syrian war, Kurdish conflict. So I mean, Syrian war, all of a sudden it happened, and it was very funny, The Assad family and Erdogan family were best buddies. And all of a sudden, they broke up. It was like a love affair. So in this respect, I think all these power relations played a role, and I think it's us who should analyze how. That's why I use them. I mean, when they're weak, they use these tactics. They are creative in creating tactics, and with this EU's discourse, I mean, democracy, life, freedom. It's a wonderful, way of being, in the scene, let's say. But when they have the power, but I don't mean that when they come to the majority necessarily, when they hold the power. And now, today, for instance, I don't think that Erdogan AKP has the majority. If you think about the last referendum, even though there's a huge fraud and many illegal, applications, throughout the election day, which was obvious for everybody, they just got 51 votes, which means that normally they couldn't have. And they lost in 5 big cities. Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir, Antep, so they are big, huge cities. So in this respect, I think we have the duty to analyze it one another. But I mean, when I listened to Yassin, I realized that, I mean, all this, the market economy thing, I mean, of course, it's not Erdogan who started market economy in Turkey, it's Özal, but he continued the process. So it started around late 1980s, after the coup. The coup opened the space, so it's like the music for the West, and so also to turn their eye for the Gülen movement's establishment in the bureaucracy. So it's also, I think, related. And so I mean, all these, fear of lack of stability. Now this is the main discourse, and also. You mentioned about, I think you didn't mention, but as far as I know, there was this muhabarat system.
Of course.
Yeah, and
Muhabarat is a word.
Which
Egyptian and Syrian thing.
Yeah, when I visited Syria, that's first of all I heard it. That's why in practice, but this as a system. After Gezi events, this muhabarat system is spying on your neighbor. So it's a spy amongst society members. This got legalized with this security law. So so on the one hand, I mean, they're enemies, but tactically they are sharing the same tactics. And the Gongos, the civil society, pro-governmental civil society, now they're everywhere. So in this respect, I think that's right. So this new market economy, but new power relations, not only market economy, is shaping it. And religion, I think it was you who said that, I mean, religion is... it's not religion, but clientelism. So I totally agree with it. For instance, one of our common friends and best friends is a human rights Muslim activist, for instance, and there were such religious, and I know that among AKP people, there are still Islamists who believe in democracy and who try to practice it, but they are not in power anymore. So of course it doesn't have to be connected with, I think, religion, but we should see religion as a part of the politics and the political discourse, not as a religious people are backwards. And that was the biggest mistake of Kemalists. They pushed religious people and the majority away. I mean, they looked down on them too much. And that's why these people feel that for the first time in their life, in a populist way, they got represented. And it is against the establishment. So they are empowered and they don't... And who else said it? I don't know. It was you, I think, in your presentation, Professor Lamet. But and there is no opposition now in HDP party members. The main not the main opposition, but the pro-Kurdish leftists. Many of them are in prison now in Turkey. So, and they were parliamentarians. You know, they are not terrorists, whatever, followers, but we are all regarded as terrorists. So I don't know whether I covered all the points. Sorry, it was in a second presentation.
You covered them for yourself and for me.
That's good.
Yeah.
Now we can go for refreshments.
No, we can go to Amr now.
The floor is yours, if you want.
Okay, so so in Egypt, this is a joke, a running joke between Yassin and me. So in Egypt, Egyptians have that stereotype about Syrians being great merchants. So they sell what they have greatly. So I liked how Yassin started his presentation by saying, well, Amr and our Turkish colleague took such a great deal of time, and I'm going to be brief until we have people as long as I told him even more. So I'm going to exactly do the same to Yassin, but now in a different way. So I am taking your time, Yassin. This is how other Egyptians do it. So I'm claiming your time. So now in honesty, I'm not sure. I mean, there are two issues which I feel at unease with in approaching that question of liberal democracy, deconstruction of liberal ideals or democratic ideals in the region. One is when we tend to see it as basically only related to ruling establishments, and we ignore the wider set of actors which are pretty much involved in what's going on. Once again, I mean, autocracies are strong, autocracies are sometimes efficient, less efficient. They use neoliberal policies, they open up economies, attract the West for security purposes, with a war on terror discourse, with an anti-illegal immigration steps, what have you. But at the end of the day, the very fact that this autocracy, and I'm referring to Egypt, and I believe the analysis can be extended to other countries in the Middle East, the very fact that this autocracy has been too eminently powerful over a long period of time, at least even if we define being powerful by the sheer fact of it's still out there, even it's managed, it was outpaced, it was out of balance in Egypt for a brief years, a set of few years, and it came back. I mean, this resilience of Middle Eastern, in my case of the Egyptian autocracy, cannot only be explained by looking at the ruling establishments and what they have been doing. I believe this is methodologically not what we should be focused on. This is one aspect which we should look at, but the realities on the ground should not be reduced to what autocracies and the ruling establishments do. It's a way bigger, grander reality where we have alternative elites or nominally alternative elites buying into that very autocratic logic and enabling the autocracy to exist for a longer time. And so my colleague from Turkey, she was referring to, which I really like, so how Erdogan, the AK party, is using democracy sort of strategy tools, and if you cast your prism a bit wider, I mean, you see how they engage the producers of the nationalistic discourse, how they engage the producer on public morality, how they engage the producer of the discourse of public morality, how they engage the producers of populist rhetoric and sentiments. And this is all embedded in society. I mean, in Egypt, the current president is a savior in uniform, one. He is a national security and war on terror man, two. He is a economic prosperity and stability guy, three. At all these three levels, very relevant for the West, but then locally and regionally, he becomes a savior of public morality, which is the only way to explain why Egypt, the Egyptian government, has an ongoing campaign against homosexuals in Egypt, why they keep arresting. This is not an Islamist rule. I mean, this is an quote unquote, in its self-perception, this is an enlightened government. But this enlightened government carries on attacks, constant attacks on homosexuals in Egypt. A savior of public morality. A savior of the dominant executive as opposed to the weak legislative and not less independent judiciary. A savior of the state bureaucracy, the savior of, which goes back to the last question on economic issues, I mean, one way of explaining why liberals in Egypt have become illiberal in their outlook is the very fact that they, at the end of the day, they do to an extent represent economic interests, and those economic interests are in structural alliance with the state. I mean, the army is the biggest producer, the biggest owner in Egypt. This is no longer a family, unlike Syria. This is not a family dynasty. It's not a family, but it's an institution. This institution outsources economic assets and financial assets, and the result is a structured dependency economically of entrepreneurs on this mighty institution. So to savior of the state bureaucracy, savior of distribution of wealth and resources and assets pattern, which serves this patronage system I was referring to. So this is a wider social, it's a wider social prism. We need to understand the resilience of autocracy and the constant new definition of illiberal sentiments, of undemocratic sentiments. First point. Second point, very briefly, I believe what goes missing in our debates right now about understanding what's happening on the ground is the fact how spaces have been reshaped by the autocracy. The economy, for example, in Egypt is very different today than it was prior to 2011. You can arguably say former President Mubarak and his regime were catering to the Western need of Egypt opening up its economy, and new entrepreneurs were emerging, and that music to the West stuff was out there in Egypt and Tunisia of Ben Ali. Right now, it's a different style of doing the economy, where we have new elites coming in, more in structured dependency on the army, but we do have a drive, a populist drive toward public ownership. I mean, otherwise you cannot explain in Egypt the grand project which the government has been announcing every second day, all the way from a Suez Canal, from a second, quote-unquote, second Suez Canal to a new administrative capital. This is a grandiose perception of the state, that father state. Here is the state back. This brings Egyptians back to the 1950s and 60s. This is by no means music to the West, even if there are some investments in the administrative capital from everywhere. But this is very much a state which is not what the West is out there looking for. But they have to take it. They have to take it in exchange of counterterrorism policies, keeping Egypt stable from a Western perspective, away from what's happening in Libya, Syria, or elsewhere. So here too, I believe we really should take a deep breath and look at what's happening on the ground. I mean, locality matters, and I'm not a big fan of saying, well, it's here like there. There are some interesting elements in each locality, even in current times, as opposed to in Egypt prior to 2011 or even prior to 2013. So casting a wider prism to understand the resilience of the autocracy, and then taking into consideration that it's not about one size that fits it all, it's way more than that.
That sounds like a good last word for right now, and thank you, each of you and all of you, for your presentations and your resilience.